My husband once looked me in the eye and said, "From now on, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. Stop chasing me." Honestly, I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You are never and will never be on my level. So I stopped. 2 weeks passed in complete silence. Then one afternoon, he showed up at my workplace, desperate to win back the woman he thought he'd already broken. You know, I will never, ever forget the chilling words my husband, Ryan, flung at me that night. Words that cut deeper than any knife could. Honestly, I can't believe I ever lowered myself enough to marry you. You were never and will never be anywhere near my level. But what he didn't realize was that in that moment of profound cruelty, a cruelty designed to break me, he had actually handed me the exact blueprint for his own spectacular downfall. It was a Tuesday night in October, and the sting of those words, man, they still echo. I was standing in our dining room, wearing this beautiful dress I'd picked out to celebrate something truly special, my Teacher of the Year award. I'd spent hours on that dinner, every detail meticulously planned. But Ryan? He strolled in 3 hours late, barely even glancing at the table. Our wedding china, flickering candles, the whole 9 yards. He just looked at me, delivered what he clearly thought was some kind of overdue correction to our marriage, and declared that from now on, he would decide when we talked, when we spent time together. I needed to stop chasing him around like some desperate puppy, he said. Then came the comparison, as if human worth could be measured on a spreadsheet. My $48,000 as a second-grade teacher against his upcoming partnership at this prestigious law firm. He declared it bluntly, we were not equals. And then, without another word, he just walked past me, into his office and closed the door, leaving me standing there alone, with the cold salmon, the dying candles, and a heart that felt like it had been surgically removed. But here's the thing. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even knock on that door, demanding answers. Instead, something cold and clear settled inside me, like ice forming on a winter lake. If my husband wanted silence and distance, if he truly believed marrying me had been him lowering himself, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. And I would do it with such perfect, unwavering compliance that 2 weeks later, he would be standing in my school lobby, holding a wilting bouquet of roses, begging for the woman he thought he had utterly broken. Before we dive deeper into Layla's journey, because, yes, this is her story, I just want to say thank you for being here, for sharing in stories of strength and reclaiming your worth. If you believe, like I do, that no one should ever be told they're beneath their partner's level, please consider subscribing. It's totally free, and it helps us reach so many more people who need to hear that they're enough. Now, you need to understand how we even got to that brutal moment, because the cruelty of that night didn't just appear out of nowhere. Oh no. It had been building for months, in ways I kept making excuses for, explaining away each small cut, until they accumulated into something I simply couldn't ignore anymore. I'd spent that whole afternoon preparing dinner, every single detail with careful, almost obsessive attention. The salmon was pan-seared exactly the way Ryan's mother had taught me during those early months of our marriage, back when she still pretended I was good enough for her son. The asparagus was roasted perfectly, just the right amount of olive oil and sea salt. I'd driven to 3 different stores to find the specific Cabernet he preferred, the kind that cost $40 a bottle and ate a significant chunk of my weekly grocery budget. I even set out the wedding china, those delicate pieces we kept in the cabinet for special occasions, gifts from relatives 3 years earlier who truly believed they were investing in a lasting marriage. The candles? The expensive, clean-burning kind, arranged in those crystal holders we'd registered for but rarely used. This dinner, for me, was supposed to mean something. After 6 years of pouring my heart into teaching second grade, helping 7-year-olds learn to read, write, and think critically about the world, I had been selected as Teacher of the Year for my school. It was more than just a recognition. It came with a small bonus that I had already mentally allocated toward the student loans I was still paying off. Loans I had taken out to support us through Ryan's final year of law school, when money was tighter than tight, and I worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. But more than the money, the award represented validation. It meant the long hours, the emotional investment, the genuine care I brought to my classroom had been noticed. Appreciated. I just wanted to share that moment with my husband. I wanted Ryan to look at me the way he used to during our first year, when he'd introduce me at firm events, his hand on the small of my back, telling his colleagues I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I wanted him to be proud of me, the way I had been so fiercely proud of him when he passed the bar exam, when he won his first major case, when the managing partner started talking about him as partnership material, despite his relative youth. 6:30 came and went. No word from Ryan, beyond a text at 5 saying he'd be home by 6:30. I checked my phone repeatedly, watching the minutes bleed into hours. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. The salmon stayed warm in the oven, losing its perfect texture. The asparagus grew soft. The candles burned down an inch. I texted him twice, asking if everything was okay, if he was still planning to come home. Nothing. By 9 o'clock, my worry had curdled into a cold resignation. This wasn't the first time he'd been hours late without explanation or apology. Over the past 6 months, it had become this painful pattern I kept making excuses for. He's under tremendous pressure at work. The partnership review is consuming all his time and energy. Important clients need attention at unpredictable hours. Big cases require late nights. I told myself these things constantly, constructing elaborate justifications for behavior that, deep down, I knew was just plain disrespect, dressed up as professional obligation. When the door finally opened at 9:30, I stood up from the dining room table, where I'd been sitting in the dimming candlelight. My heart briefly lifted with an irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, he would apologize. Maybe he would notice the effort I'd made. Maybe we could salvage something from the wreckage of this evening. But Ryan walked in wearing one of his expensive Tom Ford suits, his tie already loosened, his attention glued to his phone screen. He didn't look up. He didn't register the special china, or smell the dinner I'd kept warm, or notice the still flickering candles. He just walked right past the dining room, toward his home office, his thumbs moving across his phone in that constant typing motion that had become more familiar to me than his touch. I moved quickly, stepping into the hallway before he could disappear behind that closed door. The words tumbled out, bright and eager, in a way that honestly embarrasses me now when I remember it. I told him about the award, about being Teacher of the Year, about the recognition ceremony next month at the district gala. My voice was full of hope, excitement, and this desperate, desperate need for him. To care, to acknowledge this achievement, to show even the smallest sign that my accomplishments mattered to him. Ryan held up one hand, without even looking at me. That gesture. Small. Dismissive. It was somehow worse than anything he said afterward. It was the way you'd silence an interruption during an important phone call. The way you'd wave off a waitress trying to refill your water glass when you were in the middle of a conversation that actually mattered. He stopped in the hallway and finally looked up from his phone, and I saw his face register not interest, not pride, but pure irritation that I had delayed him from whatever he considered more important than this conversation. What he said next came out in the voice he probably used with opposing counsel when delivering bad news. Clinical, precise, utterly devoid of warmth. He told me we needed to establish some new ground rules for our marriage. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like he'd been planning this speech during his drive home, or perhaps for weeks. From now on, he would decide when we talked or spent time together. I needed to stop chasing him around like a desperate puppy begging for scraps of attention. It was exhausting, he said, and frankly beneath both of us. He paused there, loosening his tie with one hand while the other still held his phone. He hadn't stopped looking at that screen, as if he couldn't spare his full attention, even for the task of restructuring our marriage. Then came the part that would replay in my mind during every sleepless night that followed. The words that would define everything that came after. He said he couldn't believe he had ever lowered himself enough to marry me. That I was never and would never be anywhere near his level. He laid it out with the precision of a lawyer presenting evidence. I was a second-grade teacher making $48,000 a year. He was about to make partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state, with a salary that would be triple mine, at minimum. We were not equals, he declared, and he was tired of pretending we were. The comparison was delivered as fact rather than opinion, as if my worth as a human being could be accurately calculated by comparing our annual incomes and finding me catastrophically insufficient. Then he walked past me into his office and closed the door. That click. It echoed through our home with terrible finality. I stood there in the hallway between the dining room and his office, unable to move. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. From behind that closed door, I could hear the faint sound of his voice on a phone call, probably with a colleague or client, conducting business that mattered more than the wife he had just demolished. I walked slowly back to the dining room and looked at everything I had prepared. The salmon on our wedding china, now cold and congealing. The asparagus, its perfect texture lost. The expensive wine, sitting open on the table. The candles, burning lower in their crystal holders. Everything looked different now. Transformed by his words from a celebration into evidence of my foolish hope and fundamental inadequacy. This was what happened, apparently, when someone who made $48,000 a year tried to pretend she deserved recognition, or celebration, or basic respect from someone about to make partner at a prestigious firm. I did not cry that night. That fact surprised me later when I had time to think about it, because tears would have been the natural response to having your husband tell you that marrying you was an act of lowering himself. But instead of grief or heartbreak, I felt something else, arriving uninvited. It was cold and clear and merciless, like water freezing into ice, or steel being forged in a fire. The man I had married, the man whose last name I carried, the man I had supported through law school by working 2 jobs, taking out loans, sacrificing my own financial security, had just told me I would never be good enough. That my worth could be calculated on a spreadsheet comparing salaries and status. That our marriage was an act of charity on his part, rather than a partnership between equals. I stood in that dining room, staring at the closed office door, and I made a decision. If Ryan wanted silence, if he wanted to decide when we communicated, if he truly believed I was so far beneath him that our marriage represented him lowering himself, then I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would honor his request with such perfect compliance that he would eventually realize the catastrophic error he had made. I would respect his boundaries so thoroughly that he would come to understand what his life actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. I moved through the dining room like someone performing a familiar ritual for the very last time. I cleared the table, wrapped the uneaten salmon in foil, placing it in the refrigerator where it would sit untouched until I threw it away days later. I blew out the candles, watching the thin streams of smoke rise toward the ceiling. I put away the wedding china, piece by piece, wondering if we would ever use it again. And already knowing the answer, I picked up the bottle of expensive Cabernet and poured it down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away. $40 disappearing down the drain, a fitting symbol for the evening, and perhaps for our entire marriage. Then I walked upstairs to the guest room and closed that door, creating my own boundary in response to his. Sleep didn't come that night, but planning did. I lay in that unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, and I began to think through what came next with surprising clarity. Despite the shock still reverberating through my system, Ryan had just handed me something valuable, without realizing it. He had given me permission to stop trying. Permission to stop walking on eggshells. Permission to stop being the only person in our marriage who seemed to care whether it survived. He had declared the rules of engagement, and I would follow those rules with such perfect obedience that he would eventually understand what he had lost. The next morning, I woke before dawn and moved through our home with a new, quiet purpose. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, but only 1 cup. I prepared breakfast, but only enough for 1 person. When Ryan emerged from our bedroom around 7, still adjusting his cufflinks, still checking his phone, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked, confused. The confusion was brief, but it was visible. For 3 years, I had made his breakfast every morning without fail. His egg white omelette with precisely chopped vegetables. His whole wheat toast. His coffee, prepared exactly how he liked it, with 1 sugar and a splash of cream. The routine had been so consistent that he had stopped thinking about it. He had come to expect it the way you expect electricity to work when you flip a switch. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my own simple breakfast, and I looked at him calmly. I told him I assumed he would prefer to handle his own meals going forward, since he was so capable, and I was apparently so far beneath his standards that my service was no longer required. The words came out politely, with no trace of anger or sarcasm, and that seemed to confuse him even more than the absence of breakfast. Ryan opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his briefcase from the counter, where I would normally have placed it along with his dry cleaning receipt and a reminder about whatever he had asked me to handle that day. None of those things were there now. He stood for a moment, looking around the kitchen as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify, then headed toward the door. I watched him leave, without offering the kiss goodbye that had once been automatic, without reminding him about his afternoon meeting or asking what time he would be home for dinner. The door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee, feeling the silence settle around me. That silence no longer felt uncomfortable or tense. Instead, it felt full of possibility. It felt like freedom. That first day of my strategic withdrawal turned out to be harder than I had anticipated, though not for the reasons I expected. I didn't miss Ryan. I didn't feel lonely or sad or regretful about the decision I had made to give him exactly the silence he demanded. What proved difficult was breaking 3 years of carefully constructed habits that had become as automatic as breathing. My body had learned to operate a certain way, and now I was asking it to unlearn everything. I sat at my desk during morning recess, my second graders playing outside. My phone lay beside my lesson planner, and I caught my hand reaching for it without conscious thought. My thumb moved toward the screen to open my messages, muscle memory preparing to type out the usual text asking Ryan how his morning was going, or whether he needed me to pick up anything on my way home. I stopped myself just before touching the screen, pulling my hand back as if the phone had suddenly become hot. This happened again during my planning period, and again while my students were at lunch. Each time, I had to actively override the impulse that had been reinforced daily for 3 years. So, I decided to redirect that energy somewhere else. I picked up my phone and texted my sister, Claire, instead, asking if she wanted to have dinner sometime that week. We hadn't spent quality time together in months, because I always seemed to have something I needed to do for Ryan. Claire responded almost immediately, with enthusiasm and 3 exclamation points, saying she had been worried about me and would love to catch up. Then I messaged my friend Andrea, who I had been neglecting because Ryan always seemed to need something during the evening hours when I might have maintained friendships. Andrea wrote back saying she thought I had forgotten she existed and suggesting we meet for drinks Friday after work. I even responded to an email from Jenna, the 5th grade teacher down the hall, whose lunch invitations I had declined at least 6 times over the past year because I always rushed home to make sure Ryan had a proper dinner waiting. When I finally walked into the teacher's lounge that afternoon, carrying my lunch, Jenna looked up from her salad with genuine surprise. She had been sitting alone, grading papers, and her face brightened when she saw me. I asked if I could join her, and she immediately moved her stack of papers to make room. We talked about nothing particularly important. Jenna told me about her vacation to Costa Rica, showing me photos of the Eco Lodge she'd booked. She complained about a difficult parent conference she was dreading. She shared her thoughts on the new principal's questionable policy changes. I realized, as we talked, that I had missed this. This simple conversation with another adult about topics that had nothing to do with managing Ryan's needs, or anticipating his moods, or making sure his life ran smoothly. Jenna asked me how my week was going, and I found myself telling her about my Teacher of the Year award. Her reaction? It was everything Ryan should have been. She grabbed my arm and actually squealed with excitement, saying I absolutely deserved the recognition, and she had always thought I was one of the best teachers in the building. We spent the rest of lunch discussing the upcoming ceremony, what I should wear, and whether I would give a speech. When the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, I felt lighter, somehow, as if the simple act of being seen and celebrated by someone who genuinely cared had released a pressure I didn't even know I had been carrying. By day 3, Something shifted in a way I hadn't expected. I woke up that morning and went through my routine of showering, getting dressed, and preparing for work. And somewhere around the time I was brushing my teeth, I realized I hadn't thought about Ryan even once. I hadn't wondered what time he would be home. I hadn't mentally reviewed his schedule to anticipate what he might need from me. I hadn't checked my phone to see if he had sent any messages overnight. The realization stopped me mid-motion, toothbrush still in my mouth. For the first time in 3 years, Ryan was not the background program constantly running in my mind. At school that day, I taught my second graders about the water cycle with genuine focus and enthusiasm. We did an experiment with ice cubes and warm water to demonstrate evaporation and condensation, and I found myself fully present in the moment, rather than mentally planning what to cook for dinner or worrying about whether I had forgotten something Ryan needed. During recess, I helped settle a dispute between two boys fighting over the basketball court, and I handled it with patience and humor instead of the distracted efficiency I had been operating with for months. I planned the following week's lessons without once checking my phone to see if Ryan had texted. The mental space that had been consumed by managing his requirements was suddenly available for other things. I felt physically lighter, as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to walk without that weight pressing down on my shoulders. During my lunch break with Jenna, I actually tasted my food instead of eating mechanically while part of my brain was already planning dinner. I noticed the flavor of the apple slices I had packed, the texture of the sandwich bread, the cold sweetness of the iced tea. Jenna noticed the change before I fully recognized it myself. She tilted her head while watching me and said I seemed different somehow. Lighter was the word she used. She asked if something good had happened, and I told her I was just making some life adjustments. She didn't push for details, but she smiled at me with the knowing expression of someone who understood that sometimes the best changes come from finally letting go of things that were weighing you down. The transformation accelerated with each passing day after that, gathering momentum like a stone rolling downhill. I started going to the gym before school, something I had abandoned during my marriage because Ryan used to complain that I was never home in the mornings. The complaint had never made sense because he left for work before 6 a.m. and wouldn't have noticed my absence anyway, but the criticism had made me feel guilty, so I had stopped. Now, I reclaimed that morning routine. I drove to the gym at 5:30 and spent 45 minutes on the treadmill and weight machines, and I arrived at school feeling energized rather than drained. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift away over the past 3 years. Andrea and I met for drinks on Friday evening at a wine bar downtown, and we talked for 3 hours without me once checking my phone to see if Ryan needed anything. My college friend, Melissa, invited me to a weekend brunch, and I accepted without the automatic calculation of whether Ryan might want me around that day. These friendships had been neglected because Ryan always seemed to need something during the hours I might have spent maintaining connections outside our marriage. And I hadn't fully realized how isolated I had become until I started rebuilding those bridges. On Wednesday evening of my second week, I did something I had been wanting to do for years. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The class met every Wednesday from 6 to 8 p.m., time I would normally have spent preparing elaborate dinners that Ryan barely acknowledged. I walked into the studio feeling nervous and excited, and I was greeted by Margaret, the instructor. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with short silver hair and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. She had the kind of face that suggested she had lived through difficult things and emerged stronger. Margaret welcomed me with genuine warmth and showed me to a pottery wheel in the corner. She demonstrated how to center clay on the wheel, her hands moving with practiced confidence. I tried to copy her movements, but my first attempt was a disaster that collapsed into a misshapen lump within seconds. Margaret laughed kindly and told me everyone started there. She said learning pottery required patience and a willingness to fail repeatedly before anything good emerged. Then she shared something personal. She had been teaching pottery for 20 years, she said, after her second divorce forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. She had needed something that was entirely hers, something nobody could criticize or diminish or take away. Pottery became that thing for her. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than I had said, and she told me that sometimes the best things we create come from the rubble of what we thought we wanted. Her words settled over me like a blessing. I worked the clay for the rest of that class. And while nothing I made was remotely presentable, I felt something shift inside me. I was building something new from the ruins of my marriage, and it would be entirely mine. On day 7, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. During my lunch break, I drove to a bank across town where Ryan would never have reason to go. I walked into the building with my heart pounding and asked to speak with someone about opening a new account. The banker who helped me was a young woman who looked fresh out of college. She walked me through the paperwork with professional efficiency, never asking why I wanted an account separate from any joint finances. I opened a checking account in only my name and authorized the bank to set up automatic transfers from my paycheck, small amounts that Ryan would never notice missing, building a financial safety net that existed entirely outside his knowledge or control. That same week, I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I found Patricia Reeves through an online search for lawyers specializing in high-asset divorces where one spouse had a significantly higher income. Her office was downtown in a high-rise building that smelled like expensive leather and quiet power. Patricia listened to my story with the focused intensity of a predator calculating exactly how much my husband was going to pay for his arrogance. She took notes in precise handwriting and asked detailed questions. She wanted to know about our finances, about the student loans I had taken out to support us through Ryan's law school years, about the 2 jobs I had worked while he studied for the bar exam. Patricia told me that in our state, his upcoming partnership and the significant salary increase that came with it would be considered marital property subject to division, especially since I had financially supported his education and early career. When she smiled at this information, it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how to make Ryan regret every cruel word he had said to me. I left her office with a plan and a timeline. And for the first time since that terrible Tuesday night, I felt something like hope. The changes in Ryan became visible around day 10. Subtle at first, but accumulating into something I could no longer ignore, even if I had wanted to. I started noticing things during those brief moments when our paths crossed in the house we still technically shared. He would emerge from the bedroom in the morning looking disoriented, moving through the kitchen with the confused energy of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. I could hear him opening cabinets and closing them again, the sounds punctuated by long pauses that suggested he was trying to remember where things were supposed to be, or perhaps wondering why they were no longer where he expected them. His favorite coffee mug sat unused in the cabinet. For 3 years, that mug had been waiting for him every morning, filled with coffee, prepared exactly how he liked it, 1 sugar and a splash of cream, the temperature still hot, but not scalding. Now it gathered dust while I used my own mug and made only enough coffee for myself. I would stand at the counter preparing my breakfast and watch him in my peripheral vision as he opened the cabinet, saw the empty mug, and closed the cabinet again without taking it out. He never asked me to make his coffee. He never even mentioned the absence of this routine we had maintained for so long. But I could see the confusion in his posture, the way he stood there for a few extra seconds, as if waiting for something to materialize that no longer would. The dry cleaning situation provided another source of visible bewilderment. Every Thursday for 3 years, I had picked up his dress shirts and suits from the cleaner on my way home from school. The timing worked perfectly because the cleaner was between my school and our house, and Ryan always had evening meetings or court appearances that required freshly pressed clothing. Now his dress shirts hung in the cleaner's storage area with yellow tickets attached, unclaimed, because I no longer considered his wardrobe maintenance part of my responsibilities. On Thursday evening of the 2nd week, I heard him on the phone with the dry cleaner, asking about his order, his voice carrying irritation mixed with confusion about why his clothes hadn't been picked up as usual. The kitchen told its own story of deterioration. The groceries I used to purchase and organize according to his preferences were gone, replaced by items I wanted to eat without any regard for his tastes. I bought the snacks I liked, the breakfast foods that were easy to prepare for one person, the ingredients for simple meals I could make quickly after work. Ryan would open the refrigerator and stand there staring at the contents as if the items inside were written in a language he couldn't read. He was looking for the prepared meals I used to have waiting, the ingredients for his favorite dishes, the specific brand of yogurt he preferred. None of it was there anymore. I would walk past him during these moments of confusion without offering help or asking if he needed anything. I maintained the pleasant but distant demeanor you might use with a housemate you barely knew, rather than a husband you had shared a bed with for 3 years. When our paths crossed in the hallway, I smiled politely and continued to wherever I was going. When we were both in the kitchen at the same time, I prepared my food and ate it without engaging in conversation beyond basic pleasantries about the weather or reminding him that trash day was Thursday. One evening near the end of that second week, Ryan actually broke the silence I had been maintaining so carefully. I was sitting in the living room, reading a thriller I had picked up at the library, a story about a woman who systematically destroyed her abusive ex-husband's life through careful planning and patient execution. Ryan came out of his office around 8 and stood in the doorway, watching me for a moment before speaking. His voice, when he finally asked, "Is everything okay?" carried a hint of uncertainty I had never heard before. It was tentative, almost vulnerable, completely unlike the confident attorney voice he used for everything else. I looked up from my book and smiled at him with the same pleasant distance I had been maintaining since that terrible Tuesday night. I told him everything was fine. I was just respecting his boundaries and giving him the space he had requested. I reminded him that he had said he would decide when we talked or spent time together, so I was simply waiting for him to decide. The logic was perfect and airtight. How could he possibly complain that I was giving him exactly what he had demanded? He stood there for a moment longer, as if trying to find a flaw in my reasoning. His mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, then closed again. Finally, he just nodded and went back into his office. I returned to my book and felt a small surge of satisfaction. The trap I had set was working exactly as intended. Day 12 brought a new development that told me my strategy was having the desired effect. My phone rang during lunch period while I was sitting in the teacher's lounge with Jenna and 2 other teachers. We were discussing an upcoming field trip to the Science Museum, debating whether we should arrange for a guided tour or let the students explore on their own with worksheets. When Ryan's name appeared on my screen, I glanced at it briefly and declined the call without interrupting the conversation. I went back to my sandwich and continued talking about the field trip logistics as if nothing had happened. Jenna caught my eye and raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't say anything. She knew enough about my situation to understand what that declined call represented, and the look she gave me was one of approval rather than concern. After lunch, as we walked back to our classrooms, she squeezed my arm and told me, "You're doing great." She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. That evening, my phone rang again while I was at pottery class. My hands were covered in wet clay, working on a bowl that was actually starting to look like something I might not be embarrassed to display. I glanced at the screen and saw Ryan's name. Without breaking my concentration on the clay, I returned my attention to the wheel and kept working. Margaret noticed the phone call and my decision to ignore it. She gave me an approving nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between women who understand what it takes to ignore a ringing phone when you have spent years jumping to answer every call, dropping everything to accommodate someone else's needs. Over the next 2 days, Ryan called 6 more times. I answered none of them. Each ignored call felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself that I had given away without realizing the transaction was happening. Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, Thursday evening, Friday at noon, Friday evening, Saturday morning. The calls kept coming, and I kept declining them with increasing satisfaction. I was not being vindictive or cruel. I was simply following the rules he had established. He would decide when we communicated, and apparently he had not yet decided. On day 14, the calls stopped and the text messages began. The first one arrived during my planning period at school. It was brief and polite, asking if I was okay. I read it and put my phone back down without responding. The second message came an hour later, expressing confusion about why I was not answering his calls or texts. The third message that evening carried a different tone, frustration bleeding through the carefully worded sentences. He said he did not understand what was happening, that we needed to talk, that my silence was making things worse. I read each message as it arrived and deleted it without responding. What could I possibly say that would not undermine the perfect logic of my position? He had told me to stop bothering him, so I had stopped. He had said he would decide when we communicated, so I was waiting for him to decide. The fact that his attempts to initiate contact did not count as deciding was a nuance he apparently had not considered when establishing his rules. By the end of the second week, the physical evidence of Ryan's deterioration became impossible to ignore. He had stopped eating regular meals, something I could deduce from the takeout containers accumulating in the kitchen trash, Chinese food cartons, pizza boxes, fast food bags. The man who used to insist on proper home-cooked dinners every night was apparently living on whatever he could order for delivery. His dress shirts were fitting looser around his collar and shoulders, visible evidence that he was losing weight from stress and irregular eating. The dark circles under his eyes told their own story. He was not sleeping well, probably lying awake at night wondering how his perfectly planned life had suddenly spiraled out of his control. I knew he was up at odd hours because I could hear him pacing in his office at 3 o'clock in the morning, the floorboards creaking under his restless movement. Sometimes I would hear the sound of his voice talking on the phone at hours when no reasonable business call would be taking place. His carefully maintained appearance, always so important to him as he cultivated the image of a successful attorney destined for partnership, was showing cracks. I noticed a coffee stain on his tie one morning, a small imperfection he never would have tolerated when I was managing the details of his life. His hair looked uncombed more often than not. His jaw frequently showed stubble that suggested he had skipped shaving. His expensive shoes had lost their polish. The man who had told me I would never be on his level was discovering what his level actually looked like without the invisible support system I had been providing for 3 years. Every small detail I had managed. Every task I had handled without being asked. Every convenience I had arranged to make his life run smoothly had disappeared. And watching him struggle with the basic maintenance of his own existence brought me a satisfaction I had not anticipated feeling. What Ryan did not know, what he could not have predicted because he had always underestimated me, was that I had been documenting everything. While he was falling apart trying to manage his own life, I was building an airtight case for why our marriage had failed and who bore responsibility for that failure. I kept a detailed journal, recording every dismissive comment, every time he prioritized his career over our relationship, every instance of casual cruelty. The journal sat in my car, where he would never find it, pages filling with evidence written in my own hand. I had copies of our financial records downloaded onto a thumb drive that Patricia had told me to keep somewhere safe. The records showed clearly how much of my income had gone towards supporting his advancement while my own student loans remained largely unpaid. I had screenshots of text messages where he canceled plans with one-line excuses. I had emails where he dismissed my concerns as unimportant compared to his work obligations. I even had a recording from our last attempted marriage counseling session, the one he had refused to attend, where the therapist noted his absence in her official records. Patricia had reviewed all of it with the thoroughness of an attorney preparing for war, rather than a simple divorce. She assured me it demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior that would play very well in court, especially given that his partnership was about to make him significantly wealthier. The revenge I was building was not hot and impulsive. It was cold and methodical, constructed with the same careful attention I gave to everything else I did well. Day 15 arrived as a Friday afternoon, filled with the usual end-of-week energy that elementary schools carry. My second graders had been dismissed for the day, and I was in my classroom organizing books for the following week when Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled over the intercom. She asked me to come to the main office, and the request carried an unusual quality that made my pulse quicken. There was something in her tone that suggested this was not routine. My mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios as I walked down the hallway. Had something happened to my parents? Was my sister Claire okay? The corridors were lined with colorful student artwork celebrating autumn themes, construction paper leaves and pumpkins that normally brought me joy, but now seemed to blur past as I walked faster. I passed the library where afternoon story time was underway, children sitting cross-legged on the carpet, listening to Mrs. Patterson read. I passed the gymnasium where I could hear the rhythmic thump of a kickball game in progress, the sounds echoing off the high ceiling. When I reached the main office, I looked through the glass windows before entering and felt my breath catch in my throat. Ryan stood in the school lobby, wearing one of his expensive Tom Ford suits, the charcoal gray one he saved for important client meetings. In his hands, he held an enormous bouquet of roses that must have included at least 3 dozen stems, wrapped in cellophane with an elaborate bow. He looked completely out of place among the elementary school chaos that surrounded him. Children were being picked up by parents, creating the usual controlled disorder of backpacks being collected, permission slips being signed, and conversations happening at multiple volume levels. Ryan stood in the middle of this organized mess, looking lost and desperate. Mrs. Henderson sat behind the reception desk, and when she caught my eye, her expression communicated volumes without words. There was sympathy there, certainly, but also curiosity about what exactly was unfolding in her lobby and what I intended to do about it. I saw other staff members trying not to stare too obviously while absolutely watching the scene develop. My colleague, Sarah, from the 3rd grade classroom, was pretending to check her mailbox, but had clearly stopped moving. Tom, the physical education teacher, had paused in the hallway just outside the office with a stack of equipment in his arms. I took a deep breath and felt something settle over me. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was certainly part of the mixture. It was more like clarity combined with purpose. I straightened my shoulders in a gesture that felt like putting on armor, and I walked into the lobby with calm confidence. Ryan's face, when he saw me, transformed immediately. Relief flooded his features, followed quickly by desperate hope. He took a step toward me, and I noticed that his carefully maintained appearance showed signs of strain. His suit was immaculate, as always, but his face looked haggard. The dark circles under his eyes were more pronounced than they had been even a few days earlier. He had lost weight in a way that made his collar seem slightly too large. He started talking before I could say anything, words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic rush. Ryan made his living crafting perfect arguments and maintaining complete control in high-stakes negotiations. But right now, he sounded like someone who had lost his script and was improvising badly. He said he had been trying to reach me for days. He said he had been calling and texting and did not understand why I was not responding. He held out the roses toward me like they were a peace offering that would somehow reset everything between us. He explained that he had been under tremendous stress with the partnership review. He said he might have said some things he did not really mean. He suggested we go to dinner that evening at Angelo's, the Italian restaurant I used to love. We hadn't been there in over a year because Ryan was always too busy, but apparently now he had time. He talked about reconnecting and working through our problems and how much he missed me. He said he missed us as if we had been a functioning partnership rather than a one-sided arrangement where I gave everything and he took it as his due. The performance was desperate and transparent. I could see the calculation behind his words, the attorney's mind trying to find the right combination of phrases that would compel me to respond the way he wanted. But I also saw something else. I saw genuine confusion about why his usual tactics were not working. Ryan was accustomed to winning arguments through logic and persistence. He expected that showing up with expensive flowers and the right words would solve this problem the way he solved every other problem in his life. I stood there, looking at him, while the lobby around us grew progressively quieter. Several teachers had stopped what they were doing entirely and were now watching with open fascination. Mrs. Henderson had abandoned all pretense of working and was staring at the drama unfolding in her lobby with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. A group of 5 or 6 students waiting for late pickups had gone silent, sensing with the intuitive awareness children have that something important was happening, even if they couldn't understand exactly what. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearly through the lobby. I was surprised by how calm I sounded, how steady. I told Ryan that he had established very clear ground rules for our marriage 2 weeks ago. He had said he would decide when we talked. And this, now, was not him deciding we should talk. This was him deciding he wanted to talk, which was entirely different. I explained that he wanted me to be available on demand, to come running the moment he experienced even mild discomfort from the consequences of his own choices. I told him that was not how this worked anymore. My voice remained calm and measured, but every word was deliberate. I was not being emotional or vindictive. I was simply following the logical conclusion of the rules he had established. Ryan blinked at me, and I watched genuine confusion cross his features. In his world, people did not tell him no. Opposing counsel might argue their positions, but eventually negotiations happened and compromises were reached. Clients might have concerns, but Ryan convinced them to trust his judgment. His world operated on the assumption that with the right approach, any problem could be solved and any person could be persuaded. But I was refusing to be persuaded, and he did not have a framework for understanding why his performance was failing. His confusion quickly transformed into anger. I could see the shift happen in his posture and his expression. His jaw tightened. His voice, when he spoke again, carried an edge that made several of the watching children take a step back toward their parents. He said I was his wife, and the way he said it suggested this fact alone should compel my obedience. He said I could not just ignore him for 2 weeks, like he did not exist. He called what I was doing manipulative and said it constituted emotional abuse. The accusation was so absurd that I actually laughed. The sound surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. It was not a bitter laugh or a cruel one. It was genuine amusement at the complete lack of self-awareness he was displaying. Here was a man who had told me I would never be on his level, who had called marrying me an act of lowering himself, who had demanded I stop bothering him and wait silently until he decided he wanted my attention. And now he was standing in my workplace, accusing me of emotional abuse because I had given him exactly what he demanded. I told him I was following his instructions perfectly. He had requested that I stop chasing him, so I stopped. He had established that he would determine when we communicated, so I was waiting for him to determine that. He had told me I would never be on his level and that he had lowered himself by marrying me, so I was respecting his superior judgment by maintaining appropriate distance. The logic was airtight, and I delivered it with the same calm precision he had used when restructuring our marriage 2 weeks earlier. Several teachers were now watching openly without any pretense of doing anything else. Sarah had given up checking her mailbox entirely and was standing with her arms crossed, watching like this was a riveting television drama. Tom had set down his equipment and was leaning against the wall. I saw my principal, Dr. Wallace, emerge from her office. Her expression suggested she was prepared to intervene if this situation escalated to something requiring administrative action. But I also noticed something else in her eyes. It looked almost like approval of how I was handling this confrontation. Ryan stood there, holding his wilting roses, and I could see him trying to find some angle, some argument, some way to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely beyond his management. His mouth opened and closed several times as he searched for words that would not come. Then his voice changed. It dropped to something almost pleading, a tone I had never heard from him in 3 years of marriage. He asked what I wanted from him. The question itself revealed how little he understood about what was happening. This was not a negotiation where I had demands that could be met. This was not a contract dispute where the right offer would bring me back to the table. He started offering concessions like he was in a deposition. He called himself an asshole. He admitted he had been stressed and taken it out on me. He acknowledged he had said things he should not have said. Each admission came out carefully worded, and I could see him watching my face for signs that his strategy was working. He suggested we go somewhere private to talk about this, like adults, as if privacy would somehow make his casual cruelty easier to forgive or forget, as if the problem was that we were having this conversation in public, rather than the content of what he had said to me 2 weeks earlier. I looked at him standing there, and I realized something profound. I was not looking at the man I had fallen in love with 3 years earlier. I was looking at a stranger who happened to wear his face. This person genuinely believed that the appropriate combination of words and gestures could reset everything to his preferred default settings. He thought he could apologize just enough, promise just enough, perform contrition just enough, and I would return to my role of supporting his life while receiving nothing but contempt in return. The word that came out of my mouth was simple and revolutionary. No. Not an explanation or a justification or an apology for saying it. Just no. I told him I was not going to dinner with him. We were not going to talk. I was going to finish my work week and go home to my apartment. I made sure to emphasize that last part. My apartment. Not our house. My apartment that I had found and rented without his input or permission. I explained that I would enjoy a peaceful weekend without walking on eggshells or wondering if my very existence was annoying him. I suggested he leave the school, return to his office, and start getting used to what his life looked like without me managing every detail of it. My voice remained calm throughout this entire speech. I was not angry or emotional. I was simply stating facts about how things would proceed from this point forward. The information about the apartment hit Ryan with visible force. He actually took a step backward, as if I had pushed him. He repeated the words back to me, "Your apartment?" He said it like a question, even though I had not phrased it as one. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into something approaching panic. He started protesting immediately. "We lived together," he said. I was his wife. I could not just move out without discussing it with him first. He was invoking the marital contract as if it was a binding legal document that obligated my presence regardless of how he had treated me. His legalistic mind, so accustomed to controlling situations through contractual language and procedural authority, could not comprehend that some things exist outside the realm of negotiation and compliance. Some things cannot be managed through the right combination of terms and conditions. I told him to watch me. Then I turned and walked away, down the hallway toward my classroom. My sensible teaching shoes squeaked slightly on the polished floor. Behind me, I heard him call my name. His voice carried a note of genuine panic that was completely unlike his usual controlled attorney tone. He was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had lost, and the realization was clearly overwhelming his ability to maintain composure. But I did not turn around. I did not acknowledge his plea. I did not give him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten any reaction from me beyond the calm dismissal he deserved. I just kept walking until I reached my classroom door. I went inside and closed it behind me, and I stood there for a moment with my back against the door, feeling my heart pounding from the confrontation. The classroom was empty now. All my students had been picked up for the weekend. The space felt peaceful in a way that our house had not felt peaceful in months. The walls were covered with inspirational posters about perseverance and treating others with respect. I had been teaching my students these concepts every day while failing to apply them to my own life and demand them from my own husband. Student artwork hung on strings across the ceiling. Colorful drawings celebrating their dreams and hopes and the beautiful simplicity of childhood imagination. Construction paper self-portraits with written descriptions of what they wanted to be when they grew up. A firefighter, a veterinarian, a teacher like Mrs. Mitchell. That last one always made me emotional when I read it. My Teacher of the Year award sat on my desk, where I had placed it 2 weeks earlier after the district ceremony I had attended alone. Ryan had been too busy to come, he said, though I suspected the truth was that he simply didn't care enough to rearrange his schedule. The plaque was modest but meaningful. It represented recognition that the work I did mattered, that the hours I invested in helping children learn and grow had been noticed and valued. I sat down at my desk and took several deep breaths. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. It felt like peace, or at least the beginning of peace. The first tentative notes of a song I was learning to sing after years of silence. I had real responsibilities here, in this classroom. Real work that created actual value in the world. 22 second graders depended on me to teach them how to read and write and think critically. They depended on me to help them navigate conflicts with friends and understand concepts that challenged them. They depended on me to model what kindness and respect looked like in practice. And I was good at this work. I was genuinely good at it in ways that had nothing to do with salary or status or any of the metrics Ryan had used to measure my worth. My life was finally, gloriously mine again, and it felt incredible. That weekend, I met with Patricia in her downtown office. She had asked me to come in on Saturday morning to finalize our strategy. Her office building was mostly empty on weekends, our footsteps echoing in the marble lobby as I made my way to the elevators. Patricia was already at her desk when I arrived, surrounded by folders and legal documents, a cup of coffee steaming beside her keyboard. She laid out the timeline for what came next with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. By Monday morning, divorce papers would be delivered to Ryan's law office. Patricia had specifically selected the process server for this task, a man who specialized in maximizing the public nature of such deliveries. Ryan's colleagues would witness him receiving divorce papers at work, creating exactly the kind of visible disruption that law firms found distasteful. By Tuesday, I would change my phone number. Patricia had already arranged for a new number through a carrier account that Ryan could not access or trace. I would block Ryan on every social media platform, severing the digital connections that still theoretically existed between us. By Wednesday, I would meet with a realtor Patricia recommended to discuss selling our house, the one I had made into a home while Ryan had merely used as a place to sleep and work and ignore me. By Friday, I would sign the lease on the one-bedroom apartment downtown. The place in the renovated historic building with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in beautiful natural light. The space would be entirely mine, with no memories of Ryan contaminating it. I could decorate however I wanted. I could eat dinner at whatever time suited me. I could exist without constantly monitoring someone else's moods and needs. Patricia reviewed the financial documentation I had gathered over the past 2 weeks. She examined the bank statements, showing how much of my income had gone toward supporting Ryan's advancement. She studied the student loan documents, proving I had taken on significant debt to cover our living expenses while he attended law school. She reviewed the employment records showing I had worked 2 jobs during his final year of law school and his bar exam preparation. She smiled when she finished reviewing everything, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of an attorney who knew exactly how to make an opponent pay for their arrogance. She told me that Ryan's impending partnership, which he had used as justification for treating me like hired help beneath his status, would actually work in my favor during asset division. Since I had supported him through law school and the early years of his career when he was earning nothing, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. Patricia estimated I would walk away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely and have a substantial financial cushion for whatever came next. The satisfaction I felt hearing this had nothing to do with the money itself. It was about justice. It was about Ryan finally paying a price for the way he had treated me. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for early November. The kind of day that feels like a gift before winter settles in and makes you forget what mild weather feels like. I went through my teaching day with a focus I had not experienced in months. My second graders worked through a math lesson about addition and subtraction, and I found myself appreciating the metaphor, adding what you needed to your life, subtracting what no longer served you. The concepts felt applicable beyond mathematics. At 11:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. The message contained only one word: delivered. I excused myself from the classroom for a moment, stepping into the hallway, where I could take a breath without 22 small humans watching my reaction. The divorce papers had been served to Ryan at his office. Patricia had arranged for the process server to arrive during mid-morning when the office would be at its busiest. Maximum witness count, she had explained during our Saturday meeting. Ryan would open that envelope in front of his colleagues and the managing partners who were deciding his future at the firm. I imagined his face when he saw the legal documents formally ending our marriage. The careful corporate composure he worked so hard to maintain would crack in front of the people whose opinions he valued most. The thought brought me satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with justice. He had humiliated me in private. Now he would experience a fraction of that humiliation in the professional setting he cared about more than anything else. That afternoon, during my lunch break, I drove to the phone store. The clerk who helped me was efficient and professional, transferring my contacts and data to a new SIM card without asking why I needed a new number. I watched the process happen and felt something significant shifting. This new number represented a clean technological break from my old life. Ryan would no longer be able to call or text me. He would try my old number and find it disconnected. One more piece of evidence that I was serious about ending this marriage. Back at school, I used my planning period to systematically block Ryan on every social media platform where we were connected. Instagram first, then Facebook, then Twitter and LinkedIn. We had maintained the digital fiction of a happy marriage on these platforms, posting photos from vacations we had taken years ago, sharing anniversary messages that suggested we were still functioning as a couple. I erased him from my social media presence as thoroughly as I intended to erase him from my actual life. Tuesday morning brought a complication I had not anticipated. I was walking my students to the pickup area at the end of the school day when I saw Melissa standing near the entrance. Ryan's sister looked upset and disheveled in a way that was unusual for her. Melissa always presented herself with careful polish, but today her hair was slightly messy and her makeup showed signs of having been applied hastily. She approached me once I had finished helping my students find their parents. She pulled me aside to a quieter area near the school's main office. Her voice carried confusion and distress when she asked what was happening. Ryan had called her the night before in a panic, she said, talking about divorce papers being served at his office and how I had moved out without warning and was refusing to talk to him. Melissa acknowledged that Ryan could be difficult and demanding. She admitted he had been under tremendous stress with the partnership situation, but surely, she suggested, we could work this out if we just communicated properly. She used the phrase, throwing away 3 years of marriage, as if those 3 years represented some kind of investment I should protect regardless of how those years had actually felt to live through. I looked at Melissa and made a decision about what I owed her in terms of explanation. She had been friendly to me during our marriage, inviting me to coffee and including me in family events. But she had ultimately always been her brother's ally first. Still, she deserved to know the truth rather than whatever version Ryan was telling. I told her calmly and clearly what Ryan had said to me that Tuesday night in October, that he could not believe he had ever lowered himself to marry me, that I would never be on his level, that he would decide when we spent time together, and I needed to stop bothering him. I watched Melissa's face change as she processed this information. Surprise appeared first, followed quickly by discomfort that suggested she had not known the full extent of her brother's cruelty. What Melissa said next shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the situation. She looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if checking whether anyone was close enough to overhear. Then she told me something I had not known. Ryan had been telling their family for months that our marriage was basically over. He had said he made a mistake marrying someone who was not ambitious enough to keep up with his career trajectory. He was staying with me out of obligation, he had told them, but planned to end things after he made partner because the optics would be better. Melissa had been arguing with him about this. She said she had told him he was being terrible and that I had been nothing but supportive. But Ryan had dismissed her concerns the same way he had dismissed mine. She looked genuinely regretful when she shared this information. She said she should have told me sooner, but had hoped Ryan would come to his senses and realize what he was throwing away. The revelation landed with unexpected force. Ryan had not just been cruel to me in private. He had been systematically undermining our marriage to his family for months, constructing a narrative where I was the inadequate spouse holding him back from his full potential. He had been so confident I would never leave that he had told his family our marriage was essentially over, while still expecting me to cook his meals and manage every detail of his life. The information made his shock at my departure even more satisfying. He had taken me so completely for granted that he could not imagine I would actually follow through and leave. He had assumed I would always be there, quietly managing his existence, regardless of how he treated me. I thanked Melissa for telling me. I said I appreciated her honesty and that I held no ill toward her, but I also made clear that my decision was final. Ryan had shown me exactly who he was, and I had chosen to believe him. Melissa nodded slowly, and I could see her processing that her brother had created this situation entirely on his own. By Wednesday evening, Ryan had apparently moved through several stages of responding to the divorce papers. My friend Andrea called me around 7 while I was at home in my new apartment unpacking boxes. She had seen several posts Ryan made on Facebook. I couldn't see them myself because I had blocked him, but they were visible to our mutual friends and his extended network. Andrea read them to me, her voice carrying barely suppressed outrage. Ryan had posted vague statements about how marriage takes work and communication, about how some people give up instead of fighting for what matters, about how he was learning painful lessons about trust and commitment. The posts were carefully crafted to make him look like the wronged party. The devoted husband struggling to understand why his wife had suddenly abandoned him without explanation. Several of his colleagues and law school friends had commented with supportive messages. They clearly had no idea what had actually happened. They were responding to the narrative Ryan was constructing, one where he was the victim of my unreasonable behavior rather than the architect of his own relationship's collapse. Andrea was furious on my behalf. She wanted to comment on his posts and set the record straight publicly, but I told her I felt only cold amusement at his transparent attempt to control the narrative and position himself as the victim. It was such a predictable move from someone who made his living shaping stories to suit his desired outcome. I told Andrea the truth about what Ryan had said to me, the exact words he had used that Tuesday night. I gave her permission to spread that information through our friend group as she saw fit. I was done protecting his reputation and letting him rewrite history to suit his preferred story. If Ryan wanted to play the victim publicly, then people deserved to know what kind of victim he actually was. Andrea promised she would make sure the truth got out. I trusted her to handle it with the right balance of directness and discretion. She had a large network of mutual friends and a talent for strategic information sharing. By the end of the week, most of our social circle would know exactly what Ryan had said to me and why I had left. I hung up the phone and looked around my new apartment. Boxes were still stacked in corners, waiting to be unpacked. My few pieces of furniture looked sparse in the space, but it was mine. Every single inch of it belonged to me and reflected my choices rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's preferences. The systematic dismantling of my marriage was proceeding exactly according to plan. Patricia's timeline was being followed with precision. Ryan's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack as the truth spread through our social networks, and I was building something new from the pieces of my old life. Something that would be entirely mine. 3 weeks after I served divorce papers, Ryan showed up at my new apartment on a Saturday morning. I had been unpacking the last boxes from my move, organizing my small kitchen with the dishes and utensils that were mine alone, when I heard the knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach tighten when I saw him standing in the hallway. He was holding 2 coffee cups from Moretti's, the expensive cafe we used to visit during our first year of marriage when he still made romantic gestures. He looked terrible, in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. His expensive suit hung differently on his frame, suggesting he had lost more weight. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into something that looked almost bruised. His hair, usually perfectly styled, looked like he had run his hands through it repeatedly. I opened the door, but did not step aside to let him enter. I stood in the doorway, blocking access to my apartment, this space that represented freedom and new beginnings and a life he was not invited into. His voice, when he spoke, had none of the arrogant confidence that had characterized our final months together. Instead, it carried something almost tentative, uncertain. He asked if we could talk. He held out one of the coffee cups toward me, and I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. I took the coffee, but did not move from the doorway. He launched into what was clearly a prepared speech, the kind he probably practiced in front of a mirror or rehearsed during his drive over. He said he had been wrong, that the partnership pressure had made him say terrible things he did not actually mean. He told me he had started going to therapy to work on his issues with stress and communication. He said he understood now how much I had done for him, how much he had taken for granted. He wanted to prove he could be the husband I deserved. He said he was willing to do whatever it took to fix this. I listened to his entire speech with the patience of someone who no longer had any emotional investment in the outcome. I let him finish completely before I said anything. Then I asked him the question that had been forming in my mind since my conversation with Melissa. I asked if he was trying to reconcile because he actually wanted to be married to me, or because his managing partners had suggested that going through a messy divorce right before his partnership decision might reflect poorly on his judgment and stability. The way his face changed told me everything I needed to know before he even attempted to answer. There was a flicker of surprise that I had figured this out, followed immediately by careful neutrality as his attorney brain tried to formulate a response that would not confirm my suspicion. He tried to deny it. He said, of course he wanted me back because he loved me and realized what he had lost. But his delivery completely lacked conviction. His eyes would not quite meet mine, instead looking at a point somewhere over my left shoulder. His voice carried none of the certainty he brought to his legal arguments. I told him I had already discussed this possibility with Patricia. She had explained to me how law firms often viewed personal chaos as evidence of poor decision-making that might extend to professional matters. His sudden interest in reconciliation, coming exactly 3 weeks after receiving divorce papers and at precisely the time when partnership decisions were being finalized, seemed like remarkably convenient timing. I watched him realize that I had seen through his performance completely, that the woman he had dismissed as too simple and low status to match his level had actually been several steps ahead of him throughout this entire process. The realization seemed to physically deflate him. His shoulders sagged, and he looked down at the coffee cup in his hand, as if surprised to find it there. I took a breath and told him something I had been thinking about for weeks. He'd been right about one thing, I said. We were not on the same level, but he had gotten the hierarchy completely backwards. I explained that I spent my days teaching children how to read and think critically and treat each other with kindness and respect. I shaped young minds and made actual contributions to society that would ripple forward through generations in ways neither of us could fully measure. Every child I taught to read would have opportunities they would not have had otherwise. Every student I helped understand mathematical concepts would be better equipped to navigate a world that required those skills. Every time I mediated a playground dispute and taught conflict resolution, I was creating adults who might handle disagreements more constructively. Ryan, on the other hand, spent his days helping wealthy corporations find legal loopholes to avoid paying taxes and maximize profits regardless of social cost. His work paid extraordinarily well, yes, but it created no real value for anyone except his clients and his firm. He helped the already wealthy become more wealthy. He helped powerful entities avoid their social responsibilities. That was what his prestigious partnership would allow him to do more of. I said my level was just fine. I was proud of my level, and I had no interest in descending to his level, where human worth was calculated purely by salary and status, where love was transactional and conditional, where marriage was something you stayed in only when the optics benefited your career advancement. I told him the divorce would proceed exactly as planned. Patricia had assured me the settlement would be substantial, given that his partnership and the significant salary increase it brought would be considered marital property. I had supported him through law school by working 2 jobs and taking out loans that I was still paying off. I had facilitated his career advancement by managing every aspect of his personal life so he could focus entirely on professional success. Under state law, I was entitled to a significant portion of his increased earning potential. I explained that I would be walking away with enough money to pay off my student loans completely and start fresh with a substantial financial cushion. He, meanwhile, would be learning the expensive lesson that treating people like disposable assets carries real consequences. Ryan's face went through several expressions as I spoke. Shock gave way to something that looked like anger, which then transformed into what I can only describe as defeat. But he made one final attempt to salvage the situation. And this attempt revealed everything about who he truly was. His voice took on a sharp edge as he warned me that fighting the divorce would be expensive and drawn out. His firm had excellent attorneys who could make the process very difficult for me. I was making a mistake I would regret. It was a threat disguised as concern, and it confirmed everything I had come to understand about the man I had married. I smiled at him. It was the same calm smile I had given him that first morning when I stopped making his breakfast. I told him Patricia was expecting exactly this kind of intimidation tactic and had prepared accordingly. I had documentation of everything. His verbal abuse, the financial imbalance in our marriage where my income supported his advancement while my own debt remained unaddressed. The way he had told his family our marriage was over while still expecting me to cook his meals and manage his life. I mentioned the recording from our last attempted couples therapy session, the one he had refused to attend. The therapist had noted his absence and his unwillingness to work on our relationship in her official records. Patricia had explained that this kind of documentation could be very valuable in proceedings. I told him Patricia was actually hoping he would choose to fight the divorce. It would give her the opportunity to expose his behavior in detail during discovery and depositions. The process would create exactly the kind of messy public divorce his firm would view as evidence of poor judgment and instability. The very thing he was trying to avoid by attempting reconciliation would become inevitable if he chose to contest the divorce terms. I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. He was an attorney. He understood litigation strategy and risk assessment. He realized that fighting would cost him far more than the money he would lose in the settlement, his reputation at the firm, his partnership prospects, his carefully cultivated image of being a successful professional. With his life under control, all of it would be damaged by a contentious divorce that exposed how he had treated his wife. He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him trying to find some angle, some argument, some way to regain control of a situation that had completely escaped his management. But there was nothing left to say. He had played every card he had, and none of them had worked. He turned and walked away down the hallway without another word. I watched him leave, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than he actually was. When he reached the end of the hallway and turned toward the stairs, I closed my door. I stood there with my back against the door for a moment, holding the expensive coffee he had brought me. Then I walked to my kitchen sink and poured it out. I did not need his coffee or his apologies or his belated attempts at reconciliation. I had everything I needed right here, in this apartment that was entirely mine. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after pouring out Ryan's coffee, looking at the empty sink and feeling something settle inside me. It was not triumph exactly, though there was satisfaction in knowing I had handled that final confrontation with complete control. It was more like finality. The last thread connecting us had been severed, and what remained now was simply the legal process of making our separation official. For months later, that legal process concluded in a conference room at Patricia's office. Ryan and I sat on opposite sides of a polished mahogany table, signing documents that formally ended our marriage. His attorney was a sharp-looking woman named Catherine Walsh, who had clearly counseled him not to fight this battle. She reviewed the settlement terms with professional efficiency that suggested she understood her client had no good options and fighting would only make things worse. I signed each document as Patricia slid them across the table to me. The settlement was exactly what Patricia had predicted. Enough money to pay off all my student loans completely. A substantial portion of Ryan's partnership bonus that he had received 2 weeks after I filed for divorce. The bonus he had used as justification for telling me I would never be on his level. Half the equity in our house, which had sold quickly to a young couple, expecting their first child, who loved the kitchen I had renovated and the garden I had planted. Ryan looked diminished, sitting across from me, smaller than I remembered, as if the past 4 months had compressed him in ways that went beyond the physical weight loss I could see in his face. He had aged in a way that suggested stress and poor sleep and the accumulated weight of consequences he had never anticipated facing. We did not speak during the signing, except for the necessary legal acknowledgments. When his attorney asked if he understood the terms, he said yes, in a voice that carried no emotion. When Patricia asked if I had any questions before finalizing, I said no and signed the last document with my maiden name that I had already begun using again. When it was finished, I stood up and gathered my copies of the paperwork. Patricia walked me to the elevator, and as we waited for it to arrive, she told me she wished all her clients handled their divorces with the same calm, strategic clarity I had demonstrated. Most people let emotion drive their decisions in ways that cost them dearly, she said. I had approached this like someone playing chess rather than engaging in warfare, and the results spoke for themselves. I thanked her for her excellent work and told her I hoped I would never need her professional services again. We both laughed at the dark humor of that statement. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, turning to see Ryan still sitting at the conference table, visible through the glass walls of the meeting room. He looked lost in a way that might have made me feel sympathy if I had not spent 3 years watching him systematically diminish my worth. The doors closed, and I descended to the lobby, walking out into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it should have for late winter. 6 months after the divorce finalized, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee made exactly how I liked it. Strong and black, with nothing to dilute the bitter richness I had come to prefer. My apartment had become fully mine in ways that went far beyond legal ownership. The handmade pottery from Margaret's classes filled the open shelves in my kitchen. Each piece representing a Wednesday evening I had spent learning to create something beautiful with my own hands. My books were arranged in an order that made sense only to me, organized by when I planned to read them rather than by author or genre. The morning light came through windows dressed with curtains I had chosen without considering anyone else's opinion, a deep blue that made the space feel calm and peaceful. I had kept teaching at the same elementary school where the public confrontation with Ryan had happened. If anything, the other teachers now treated me with additional warmth and respect, as if I had passed some kind of test by standing up for myself in front of witnesses. My second graders that year were a particularly delightful group, full of curiosity and energy, and the kind of questions that made me think carefully about how to explain complex ideas in ways 7-year-olds could understand. I had poured energy into my teaching that previously had been diverted into managing Ryan's needs and moods. My lesson plans were more creative. My patience with difficult students was greater. My enthusiasm for the act of teaching, it was back. The Teacher of the Year award that had sparked everything now sat on a shelf in my apartment alongside the pottery I had made. A reminder that my work had value, regardless of whether anyone at home acknowledged it. I had reconnected with old friends and made new ones through my pottery class and the book club Jenna had invited me to join. My social life existed entirely on my terms now, built around people who added value to my life rather than draining energy from it. My sister, Claire, had become one of my closest confidants. Our relationship deepening now that I no longer had to pretend everything was fine in my marriage. We talked on the phone several times a week and met for brunch every Sunday, conversations that ranged from serious discussions about our parents' aging to silly debates about reality television shows we both watched. Andrea called me one evening in early spring with news she had heard through the law firm gossip network that still connected her to people who knew Ryan professionally. She prefaced the information by asking if I even wanted to hear updates about him, and I almost said no, but curiosity won out. The partnership Ryan had treated as inevitable had been deferred for at least another year. The managing partners had cited concerns about his judgment and stability during what they described as a personally difficult period. The divorce and the circumstances surrounding it had reached the firm's leadership through channels Ryan had not controlled. They had decided he needed to demonstrate sustained professional excellence before they would consider elevating him to partner. Andrea said her source indicated Ryan had been furious, but had no recourse except to accept the decision and try to prove himself over the coming year. The thing he had valued more than our marriage, the achievement he had used as justification for treating me like I was beneath him, had been delayed partly because of how he had handled our relationship. I felt no satisfaction from this news, which surprised me. I had imagined during the early weeks after leaving that I would enjoy knowing his actions had cost him professionally. But sitting in my apartment, listening to Andrea share this information, I felt only a distant sense that justice had been served in ways I had not orchestrated or controlled. The universe apparently had its own way of balancing accounts without requiring my continued involvement. I told Andrea I appreciated her sharing the information, but that I was ready to stop tracking Ryan's life and focus entirely on building my own. She understood immediately what I meant without requiring further explanation. We moved on to talking about other things, and I realized that Ryan was becoming what he should have been all along, a person from my past rather than someone who occupied space in my present. Sitting in my apartment as spring arrived and brought warmer weather and longer days, I reflected on what revenge actually meant in the context of my divorce. The revenge had not been in destroying Ryan, though the financial settlement and the impact on his partnership aspirations certainly caused him difficulty. The revenge had not been in public humiliation, though the confrontation at my school and the gossip that followed had damaged his carefully cultivated image. The real revenge was simpler and more profound. The revenge was peace. Waking up each morning without anxiety about what mood I would find when I went downstairs. Going through my days without walking on eggshells or monitoring my tone, or wondering if some innocuous comment would trigger an argument. Coming home to silence that felt welcoming rather than tense. The revenge was choosing myself after spending 3 years choosing someone else. Reclaiming the energy and attention I had poured into a person who viewed my love as weakness and my support as entitlement. Understanding that I had always been exactly the right size, exactly the right level, exactly enough, and that Ryan's inability to see that reflected his deficiency rather than mine. I was a teacher who shaped young minds and made differences in children's lives that would ripple forward through generations. That was enough. That had always been enough. And if Ryan ever figured out what he had lost, the woman who had loved him unconditionally before he taught her that some people do not deserve unconditional love, it would be far too late. The woman he tried to diminish had turned out to be stronger than he ever imagined. She had walked away with her dignity intact and her future bright with possibility, and she was drinking her coffee exactly how she liked it, in an apartment that was entirely hers, on a Saturday morning that belonged to no one but herself.